General Motors produced some beautiful vehicles over the years, including this 1948 Cadillac sedanette coupe that you see here, which was the first Cadillac to feature those beautiful vertical fins, which would become a signature of Cadillac all the way through to today. However, while the sedanette is unquestionably a beautiful vehicle, over the years General Motors made some, let's just say, interesting decisions when it came to various cost savings initiatives. And what we're going to do in this video is talk about what I think are the top 10 most egregious or worst cost savings ideas that General Motors actually implemented. Now, if I forget one or you have one, be sure to put a comment in the comment section and let me know what it is, because I may feature it in a future video. Let's get started with number 10. At number 10, we have the GM interiors of the 1990s, the so-called interiors by Play School or My First Interior. Now, GM had started cheaping out, I would say, at interiors beginning around the 1968, 1969 model year. If you look at a General Motors car from the mid-1960s, like 1965 or 1966, and then you compare it to a General Motors car from around 1969, and certainly by the early 1970s, the interior quality had already started to slip. And this wasn't really rectified for a number of years. When the new generation of full-size cars came out in 1977 and the intermediates, the A-bodies in 1978, I would say they had a little bit better interiors than the previous generations that they replaced, but not necessarily a huge step forward. However, when GM actually introduced its downsized full-size vehicles in 1985, the C-bodies, the Buick Electra, the Olds 98, the Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood, the interiors were actually pretty nice on those vehicles with good fit and finish and good material quality. It's almost like GM was trying to put more money into the interiors to convince buyers of former large V8 powered luxury cars to transition to one of these vehicles. And it worked. The cars sold very, very well in 1985, those downsized full-size vehicles. And I would say GM interiors had some interesting features and innovative features all throughout kind of the 80s until the early 90s. And that's when GM started going through its, let's say, financial troubles. In particular, in 1992, the company lost billions of dollars. And really, from that point forward, you can start to see cost being taken out of the interiors again as they tried to return to profitability. And I think the nadir for GM interiors was really in the mid to late 1990s. Those vehicles that were produced in that time frame, pre-Bob Lutz coming to General Motors in 2001, really, I think, reflect the doldrums of GM interiors. And a number of people would say that those interiors looked like solidified lava, lots of hard black plastic everywhere, unattractive, not really even all that compelling of themes on the inside, aside from the materials. I think the absolute nadir for GM interiors was probably the Saturn Ion interior that you see here with that center stack in the middle, which Toyota was admittedly doing on cars like the Yaris, but the material quality in the Saturn Ion was just abysmal. It was wretchedly bad. And thankfully, General Motors, a few years later, after Bob Lutz's return, really started putting money in interiors and generated some vehicles with absolutely beautiful interiors after that point. So I think by and large they learned their lesson, but those cars from GM that were developed in the early to mid-90s, that were released in the mid to late 90s, where they had to go through cost-cutting exercises in order to be profitable, just weren't good on an interior standpoint. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have the ubiquitous so-called mouse fur headliners that General Motors used generally from the 1970s all the way through to the 1990s era. And I call them mouse fur headliners because they just were not great overall. Now, a lot of these headliners, it was a good idea. It was a one-piece headliner that had kind of a cardboard-style backing, and then there was an adhesive foam that adhered to the cardboard, and then there was a piece of fabric that would adhere to the foam. So you got some sound deadening. It was relatively easy to install. It was a big cost savings because remember the headliners before this had the bows in the headliner and the material was woven to them. And here it was just a piece of cardboard that you kind of pushed up into the headliner, and that was about it. I think one of the early cars that had this was a car like my 1970 Buick Electra. it had a one-piece headliner without roof bows, but that was, I think, a very expensive headliner. It was super thick in terms of the overall padding, and it was very effective, and it never drooped. But for whatever reason, any of these headliners that were put in GM cars from, I would say, the late 1970s through to the early 90s, they just ended up drooping after a little bit of time, and you'd have to get them replaced. So that was really the downside. Otherwise, the headliners were inoffensive. It was just that they would droop, the foam would start to degrade, the foam was adhered to the cloth, usually would start in a little pocket, and if you were somebody who liked the windows down, well, the wind would kind of ruffle that little pocket and then continue to stretch it more and more and more until you had to just replace the whole headliner. So that was one of the least favorite cost savings ideas that I have from GM, particularly of that era, and it lent a lot of, let's say, gave a lot of business to companies who would redo those headliners. Let's move on to number 8, and we're going to switch to some things under hood now. And the first is this turbohydromatic 200 transmission. Now, the turbohydromatic 200 transmission was originally developed for the T cars, the Chevrolet Chevette as an example, the Pontiac Acadian, if you were in Canada, the Pontiac T1000 in the US. And it wasn't a horrible transmission when it was behind a 4-cylinder engine. It was really just fine. But as the years went on and General Motors realized that it had to meet corporate average fuel economy standards, this turbohydromatic 200 transmission found its way behind engines like Chevrolet 305s and even in full-size cars like the Caprice and Impala. And this is before, I'm not talking about the 204R now that would come out in the early 80s. This is the early turbohydromatic 200 that was just a 3-speed and the turbohydromatic 200C that was a 3-speed with a lockup torque converter. So the problem was that this transmission was designed really to be lightweight, and it didn't have the internals and the beefiness of the turbohydromatic 350 or the turbohydromatic 400, and consequently, it would just fail. Now, it was in part a cost savings move. GM was trying to develop a cheaper transmission, and it was also a weight savings move, both. And that lent it to being behind, like I said, a lot of different engines. Quite a few V8s, lots of Chevy 305s had the turbohydromatic 200 behind it. The Olds diesels also had the turbohydromatic 200 behind it. And the little engines like the Olds 260, the Pontiac 265 had the turbohydromatic 200 transmission behind it. Even Pontiac 301s in some cases. So it just was not a good transmission. And if you tried to tow anything with it, remember that people were used to having their V8 powered car and be able to tow up to about 5,000 pounds behind it. If you tried to tow something that was even a couple thousand pounds with one of these transmissions, it was just over. It was not going to work, unfortunately. So I think this was a unfortunate cost savings move by GM. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have the Olds 403 V8 and its hollow main bearing webs. Now, the Olds 403 was an engine that was introduced for the 1977 model year. Oldsmobile used to produce great engines, the Olds 350, the 400, 425, 455. These were all excellent V8 engines that just lasted a long period of time and were extremely durable. But with the introduction of the Olds 403 in 1977, it really was the top GM corporate V8 engine now that the 455s are gone. All the 455s are gone from passenger cars, as well as the Chevrolet 454 and the Cadillac 500 was also gone after the 1976 model year. So that left the Olds 403 now as the top choice. And the 403 was an enlarged small block. It had a super over square bore and a relatively short stroke, Siamese cylinders that some would say contributed to overheating conditions in some cases. But I think the most egregious issue with the Olds 403 was the poor bottom end. And take a look here at this photo, and you can see the hollowed out main bearing webs in the Olds 403s. And you can just imagine what that does to the structure of the lower end of the engine. I believe this was done for lightweighting. It was also done for cost purposes. Remember, again, this was the time where, as I just mentioned in the previous segment on the turbohydromatic 200, that GM was looking for weight savings ideas. But when you do something like this, you're really weakening the bottom end of the engine. And consequently, the Olds 403 was an engine that some would say, as I mentioned, had overheating issues. And then on top of that, the lower end was weak. So These engines were even in police cars, and the police departments kind of lamented the cars that had them because the engines would blow. They just couldn't rev and stay north of 4,000 RPMs for very long. The bottom ends would come apart for obvious reasons. Now, I will say this. The Olds 403 actually was not a bad engine if you just drove it normally. If you drove it normally, you didn't keep your foot in it all the time and the pedal to the floor and have it rev super high, it generally was fine and didn't come apart. But if you drove it hard and you drove it near that red line or north of 4,000 RPM for an extended period of time, bad things were going to happen. And I wonder if this is one of the reasons why GM chose to put the Olds 403 actually in the Pontiac Trans Am. At one point, they put the Pontiac 400 V8 behind the manual transmission cars because people were going to rev those pretty high. But if you got the automatic transmission cars in the Trans Ams, you got Olds 403 V8s. And I think that was because they thought that the automatic transmission 403 could just handle it because it was going to upshift at the right point in time and wasn't going to risk being over-revved. That was also during a time where Pontiac was really getting rid of the last of their 400 V8s, and they needed something that was similarly sized to offer it in the Trans Ams until the end of that run. So this is another one of my least favorite cost savings ideas. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the radiator in the Chevrolet Vega. Now, when the Vega was introduced in 1971, it was a beautiful little car. It kind of looked like a mini Camaro. I think it's one of the best styled small cars ever. If I'm honest, it's a great looking vehicle. But one of the Achilles heels of the Vega, in addition to just being so rust prone, was what was under hood. And that was the aluminum block, iron head, 4-cylinder engine. And the engine itself had its issues. It was an aluminum block without cylinder liners. It was treated, but because in part of the radiator, the engine had arguably more issues than what was intended or what GM engineers thought that it was going to have. What do I mean by that? Well, in these Vegas, the early Vegas, the radiator was about 1 foot by 1 foot. It was the smallest radiator in a car that I've ever seen. And while that would generally prove adequate on most days, the testing procedure for GM actually specified that the person who was running the test should check all the fluids before the test was begun. Now, the problem with that was not what typically happened in the real world. Everybody didn't just pop their hood every morning and check all the fluids. So the coolant would start to get low. And when you only have this teeny tiny radiator, any loss of coolant is material. And so what would end up happening is the engine would start losing some coolant, and then you'd have the problem of it would start overheating. And once it overheated, the piston rings would basically adhere themselves to the cylinder walls. Maybe that's a little bit extreme, but they would basically end up eating away at the cylinder bores, and then the car would become an oil burner from that point forward. So it was not a great idea to make this radiator so gosh darn small, and it created a significant amount of issues for the car in addition to others. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have the Cadillac HT4100 V8's use of RTV. Now, the HT4100 was introduced in 1982 and continued on to the 1987 model year and was a Cadillac exclusive engine, yet another aluminum block, iron head engine like the Vega engine. Although this one had cast iron cylinder liners, it still proved problematic. By and large, that was because you had the aluminum block, an iron head, and an aluminum intake sandwiched all together, 3 different surfaces that were expanding and contracting at different rates. And as a result, intake gaskets would blow, head gaskets would blow, and bad things would happen. But one of the things about the HT4100, the early versions, was that General Motors, I guess, fell in love, and particularly Cadillac Engineering, fell in love with RTV, or room temperature vulcanizing sealant. And they used it everywhere on this car in lieu of gaskets. So, as an example, the valve covers, they did not originally have gaskets on the original HT4100s. They used RTV to seal it. And in order for this to work, you have to have perfectly clean surfaces. The sealant has to cure for the right amount of time. And I would just hypothesize that that was not necessarily the case in the factory environment, that the surfaces were not perfectly clean, and they had some challenges with the cure time and maybe even the sealant itself. Because eventually GM would switch to using gaskets, and they do sell gaskets now for the valve covers on those early HT4100s. because just use RTV is not necessarily a success story. And I don't think there are many cars, certainly the General Motors put together afterward, that just use RTV. But that was Cadillac's love during this particular time frame. And in addition to the other issues that engine had, it was an oil leaker, too, out of various surfaces because of the RTV usage. Now let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have the lack of the rear windows dropping in the new for 1978 four-door intermediate vehicles. Now, General Motors had downsized its full-size vehicles for 1977. Those cars had rear windows that dropped, although not all the way. They kind of dropped part way. But the new for 1978 intermediates, the A-body cars like the Olds Cutlass, the Buick Skylark, the Buick Regal, the Pontiac Grand Prix, Pontiac Grand Am, Chevrolet Malibu, etc., all on the four-door cars had rear windows that did not go down. They were fixed in place. Now, why in the world would General Motors do this? Well, one reason was weight savings. Obviously, during this time frame, GM knew they was going to have to meet corporate average fuel economy standards of 27.5 miles per gallon by the mid to late 1980s. So saving the window regulator and window mechanisms, well, that saves weight in the rear doors. It also gave you more space in the rear because the door panels could be thinner. And it saved cost. So it was a win-win. I think General Motors had done market research that suggested that, well, more often than not, there aren't people riding in the back seat. And when there aren't people riding in the back seat, the driver and passenger just put down the front windows. So it was kind of like a no harm, no foul, and get to save weight, give the passengers a little bit more space, and save some cost. So win-win for everybody. But unfortunately, it was just a bizarre solution that never really came to be accepted. Even Chrysler did this when the K cars first came out. It was the same. The rear windows did not go down. And while Chrysler would later renege on that decision and enable the K car rear door windows to go down, General Motors would stick with this philosophy all through that rear-wheel drive A, soon-to-be relabeled G body in 1982. That whole platform lifetime, they would keep these rear door glasses fixed, except you could get a little vent pane that opened, and that was what the rear passenger got. But it was just something that never was a great decision, I think, in the buying public's mind. It just reinforced that these cars had been costed out pretty significantly. The A, subsequently G bodies, were not horrible cars, but I would say the ones were made from 1978 to about 1983. The quality wasn't that great. The later ones soldiered on, the Buick Regal Coupes, the Olds Cutlass Coupes, for many years, the Olds all the way up until 1988, and it was a great seller, and actually was, by that point, a really good car. But this was something that I don't think anybody really got comfortable with if they bought one of these four-door vehicles. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have back to the Chevrolet Vega, the Vega Vert-a-Pac car that was developed between General Motors and Southern Pacific Railway. Now, most cars were shipped on trains at this point, and when they were shipped on trains, there were about 15 cars that could be loaded in a given train. Now, the issue with the Vega was that you could get 15 cars in a typical train car, but you weren't even coming close to the capacity of what the train car could hold from a weight perspective. And so General Motors worked with Southern Pacific Railway and developed these Vert-a-Pac cars where the Vegas would get loaded and then a forklift would basically close a vertical door so the car was standing nose end facing the ground as it was transported. Now, I know that you could get 18 cars in these Vert-a-Pac train cars as opposed to 15 vehicles in the normal train car, but the effort that had to be undertaken in order to achieve this was just monumental. I mean, you had to imagine, you had to put baffles in the oil pans of the Vegas. They had to make sure that the battery was sealed correctly. I believe even GM developed a new battery for the Vegas just so that it wouldn't leak battery acid when it was tipped vertical. And then you had to have some unique systems to unload these vehicles. So it really just wasn't a great idea. I think that GM just became enamored with the idea that they could ship a little bit more vehicles, let's say a little more than a little, 20% more vehicles per rail car with this setup, but it just never really was a great idea, and it wasn't used on any other GM cars. They were thinking about using something similar on other vehicles that just didn't work. But the Vega was one where not only did you have the radiator and you had the engine, but you also had a very strange method of shipping the cars across the country. Let's move on to number two. And number two is a fun one, and that is the Oldsmobile V8 diesel design. I'm just going to say that in its entirety. Now, when Oldsmobile introduced its 350 cubic inch diesel for 1978, it wasn't necessarily a bad idea to start with a gasoline engine, and it wasn't that these diesels ended up being just converted gasoline engines with very minor modifications. They had different internals, different crankshafts, different rods, different pistons, different blocks. They were materially different, but there was something, and actually more than something, a few things that remained the same, and that really was the Achilles heel for this diesel. I would say if I had to pinpoint one of the worst decisions, it was to employ the same cylinder head bolt pattern as the gasoline engine with 10 bolts per side. Now, a regular Oldsmobile V8 gasoline engine had about 8-to-1 compression ratio. These diesels had 22-ish to 1 compression ratio. So you can imagine the force that's occurring on those head bolts. And it's the same amount of head bolts. Oldsmobile wanted to reuse the tooling between the gas and the diesel engines. And so they used the same bolt pattern. And, well, that just proved disastrous because the head bolts would stretch and the head gaskets would blow. And then the head gaskets blow, coolant gets in the oil, and bad things happen. So that was really a disastrous decision on Oldsmobile's part, probably the worst decision. And the other disastrous decision was that Oldsmobile kind of, I would say, with no excuse, never equipped any of these vehicles with a water separator. So they had a fuel filter at the back of the engine that you could change, but many diesels of the time, remember this is when diesel fuel wasn't all that high quality, relatively speaking to today. So diesel fuel typically attracts moisture, and of course moisture is not combustible and ruins injectors and the injector pump and everything like that. And for whatever reason, Olds just never equipped any of these Oldsmobile diesel cars with a water separator. If the cars had a water separator and they had better head bolts with more clamping force, I actually think the diesel could have been okay. They were stinky, they were a little noisy, but I'll tell you, they did deliver on the fuel economy. I had a 79 Seville diesel as my first car ever bought, and I used to get 25, 26 miles per gallon routinely with it. It was slow as heck. I think it was about 18 seconds, 0 to 60. That was something that customers probably didn't like either. But, you kind of put up for it, knowing that you could drive a big car and you could get good fuel economy. That was just the penalty that you paid. And it wasn't a huge penalty if the car could have been deemed reliable. But those two decisions on the Olds diesel in particular really doomed it. There were other issues with the diesels, but the head bolts as well as the lack of a water separator just doomed the engine. And now we're going to move on to number one. This is one, I made this number one because it's very obscure. This is for the true auto aficionado. The worst GM decision from a cost-cutting perspective is this little trim piece that was added to the front portion of the door on Buick Electra estate wagons for the first few model years that they were introduced in 1977. And when the Electra estate wagon was introduced for 1977, GM wanted to be able to use the same doors on the wagons across the entire lineup. Didn't matter if you had a Chevrolet, Pontiac, Olds, or Buick. But Buick must have insisted that they wanted to have their particular front-end styling treatment, and it didn't mate up with the Chevrolet Caprice-style door, whereas the other divisions were able to work the styling of the front end and the surfacing such that there was just a smooth transition from that front fender through to the door. But Buick insisted for 1977, 78, and 79 that they wanted their front end, and it didn't mate up with that door that GM wanted to use. And so what was the General Motors solution? Well, it was this plastic applique part that was applied to the top of the door from the mirror forward on either side so that it would smooth out the underlying surface and you wouldn't read that it was totally different than the Buick front-end sheet metal because it was using the Chevrolet door. And the solution just looks terrible. It's awful. This applique that it terminates underneath the mirror. I think they did that so it was more readily disguised, but it's not. They're not fooling anybody with this. It just looks awful. And I think this is the worst General Motors cost-cutting idea. They could have at least had the designers try to integrate something in the front-end styling, or they could have tooled up for a different door outer or something. But to just have this applique that terminates at the mirror and kind of, I would say, let's just call it not a seamless transition to the door sheet metal. Well, that is, I think, the most egregious cost-cutting decision that GM has made. Maybe that's stretching it. Some of these other ones are more egregious than this one, but I think this one's the most fun in terms of a trivia perspective because not many people know about this very unique aspect of the 1977 to 79 Buick Electra estate wagons. Now, if I forgot something, put a comment in the comment section. Hopefully you enjoyed this segment. Let me know what you thought. And thanks again for watching. And to close out, if you're a true automotive trivia nerd, I encourage you to check out a new YouTube channel called Auto Esoterica. It's started by a friend named Jim Hall, and he is even more of a car nerd than myself. In this video that is linked in the bottom right here, you can click on the thumbnail and it'll take you to it. Jim discusses Jaguar's new rebranding, and Jim has a lot of industry expertise. He worked for some of the big name auto companies and even one of the big automotive buff book publications. So very knowledgeable fellow. Check out his YouTube channel, Auto Esoterica.